Haven 7 had been designed by committee, which explained why it looked like a shopping mall, had violent intercourse with a space station, and somehow produced viable offspring. The architects, a collection of 7 different species who apparently believed democracy extended to structural engineering, had created what the tourism board cheerfully called a harmonious blend of interspecies design philosophy. What they'd actually created was a metallic nightmare, where Centaurian crystal gardens grew next to Veltari scratching posts, while human coffee shops sat awkwardly beside pools of liquid methane that the frigid collective called refreshment stations. The station's promotional materials boasted about its unprecedented multicultural harmony, a phrase that roughly translated to, "We've managed to keep the murder rate below double digits for 3 consecutive months." Various species mingled in the common areas with the sort of forced politeness typically reserved for office holiday parties and hostage negotiations. Children of different species played together in designated areas, their parents watching with expressions that suggested they were either witnessing the dawn of galactic peace or calculating the nearest exit routes. The Administrative Council had thoughtfully provided universal translators, though these devices had the unfortunate tendency to convert casual conversation into what sounded like diplomatic negotiations. A simple hello became greetings, carbon-based entity, I acknowledge your existence within acceptable parameters, while nice weather somehow translated to the atmospheric conditions are sufficiently non-lethal for continued biological function. In this carefully orchestrated chaos lived Iris Chen Nakamura, a woman whose appearance suggested she'd been assembled from spare parts of a suburban soccer mom and a corporate middle manager. She wore the kind of unremarkable clothing that made her blend into backgrounds like human camouflage, possessed the sort of forgettable face that security cameras seem to gloss over, and moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to navigate crowded spaces without bumping into anything important. Her official designation read Civilian Contractor, Data Analysis, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of saying, she does computer things, we think. Most residents of Haven 7 had the good sense to avoid asking too many questions about what Earth civilian contractors actually did, partly because the answers were usually boring, and partly because humans had developed a reputation for being either completely harmless or absolutely terrifying, with very little middle ground. The other species had learned to treat humans like weather patterns, generally predictable, occasionally violent, and best observed from a safe distance. Iris's most notable feature was her 8-year-old son, Ethan, who possessed the unique ability to turn any environment into a playground and any quiet moment into a symphony of questions. The boy had inherited his mother's unremarkable appearance and added to it the sort of boundless energy that made other parents question their life choices. He approached each day with the enthusiasm of a small-scale natural disaster, leaving behind a trail of curious alien children who seemed drawn to his particular brand of organized chaos. The station's recreational facilities included what optimists called a multi-species playground, though it resembled something designed by someone who'd heard playgrounds described second-hand by someone who'd only seen them in nightmares. The equipment had been engineered to accommodate everything from the Veltari's natural climbing instincts to the aquatic collective's need for shallow pools, resulting in a structure that looked like abstract art, had gotten into a fight with safety regulations and lost. On this particular day, Ethan had been engaged in what human children called playing, and what other species young called organized learning experiences. He'd been demonstrating the human concept of tag to a group of Centaurian larvae, whose crystalline structure made them particularly bad at running, but excellent at reflecting light in amusing patterns. The game had evolved into something resembling interpretive dance performed by disco balls, with Ethan serving as the enthusiastic choreographer. The entertainment came to an abrupt halt when 3 Veltari adolescents approached with the sort of swagger that suggested they'd recently discovered they were bigger than someone else and intended to make it everyone's problem. Veltari resembled what might happen if cats had evolved opposable thumbs and an unfortunate tendency toward bureaucracy. Their leader, a particularly fluffy specimen named Nextar, had been blessed with the sort of natural confidence that comes from never having experienced actual consequences. Human spawn, Nextar announced, his translator rendering the words with the sort of casual disdain usually reserved for discussing expired food. You disturb our meditation zone with your noise. The meditation zone in question was a patch of artificial grass where the three had been engaged in what appeared to be competitive lounging, an activity that required the sort of dedication to stillness that most species confused with either enlightenment or death. Ethan, who had inherited his mother's talent for reading situations along with her brown eyes, recognized the subtle signs of impending trouble. Unfortunately, he'd also inherited the sort of optimism that made him believe talking could solve problems that clearly required running away very fast. "We're just playing," he said, his voice carrying the sort of reasonable tone that adults used when explaining why vegetables were necessary. "We can move if you want this spot." Nextar's whiskers twitched with the sort of irritation that suggested he'd been hoping for resistance. The other two Veltari flanked him with the practiced ease of experienced bullies, their postures radiating the kind of menace that made small creatures instinctively check for exit routes. "Human spawn thinks it can negotiate," one of the flankers observed, his tone suggesting that humans attempting diplomacy was roughly equivalent to watching furniture try to dance. "Perhaps it needs lesson in proper respect," Nextar replied, his claws extending with the sort of casual threat that made the Centaurian larvae begin rapidly changing colors in patterns that roughly translated to, "We should probably leave now." The slap, when it came, carried the sort of casual cruelty that bullies had perfected across every species in the galaxy. Nextar's paw connected with Ethan's cheek with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed. The human child staggered back, his hand rising to touch the red mark that was already forming, while the other children scattered with the sort of speed that suggested they'd witnessed something that would require extensive therapy to forget. The three Veltari watched with the satisfaction of predators who'd successfully established dominance over prey, their postures radiating the sort of smug confidence that came from believing they'd acted without consequences. They had, after all, been careful to ensure no adults were watching. What they hadn't noticed was the figure in unremarkable clothing who'd been observing from behind a Centaurian crystal formation, her expression shifting from casual interest to something considerably more professional. Iris Chen Anakamura's face had taken on the sort of neutral expression that suggested she was performing complex calculations, though what she was calculating might have given the three bullies pause if they'd been paying attention. But then, paying attention to details had never been their strong suit. Ethan arrived at their modest quarters with the sort of carefully neutral expression that children perfected when they'd experienced something they weren't sure they should mention. His left cheek bore a red mark that had already begun to darken, and he moved with the particular stiffness that came from trying to appear normal, while everything felt decidedly abnormal. Iris looked up from her workstation, where she'd been engaged in what her official job description called data analysis, but which actually involved monitoring 17 different communication networks for patterns that might indicate brewing conflicts. Her eyes immediately focused on the bruise, with the sort of precision that suggested she'd been trained to catalogue injuries by type, severity, and probable cause. "Interesting afternoon?" she asked, her tone carrying the sort of casual concern that masked a much deeper level of professional interest. She'd learned long ago that children responded better to questions than interrogations, though the distinction was often purely semantic. "Just playing," Ethan replied, which was the sort of answer that contained exactly enough truth to be technically accurate while omitting everything that mattered. He settled onto the couch with the careful movements of someone whose face hurt more than he wanted to admit. Iris saved her work and closed the terminal with movements that appeared casual but were actually the sort of precise actions that came from years of training. She moved to the kitchen area and began preparing snacks with a sort of efficient domesticity that would have seemed completely normal to anyone who hadn't noticed that she kept her knives sharp enough to perform surgery. "The Veltari children were there today," she observed, her voice carrying the sort of conversational tone that invited elaboration while carefully avoiding anything that might sound like prying. "They seem to have strong opinions about playground etiquette." Ethan's shoulders tensed slightly, a reaction that might have escaped notice from most parents, but which Iris catalogued with the sort of professional attention to detail that had once made her extremely valuable to certain government organizations. The boy had inherited her tendency toward careful observation, which meant he was probably calculating exactly how much truth he could safely reveal. Nextar said we were too loud, he admitted, his fingers tracing patterns on the couch cushion. He wanted us to move. And did you? Iris asked, though she already knew the answer from the evidence written across her son's face. She'd watched the entire encounter from her position behind the crystal formation, her presence as undetectable as smoke. I said we could, Ethan replied, his voice carrying the sort of frustrated confusion that came from discovering that reasonable responses didn't always produce reasonable results. But I guess that wasn't what he wanted to hear. The mark on his cheek had darkened to the sort of purple that would require concealer for the next week. Assuming they wanted to avoid the sort of attention that came from having a visibly injured child on a diplomatic station, Iris made a mental note to acquire appropriate cosmetics, though she suspected that particular shopping trip would be unnecessary. Something cold had settled in her chest, a familiar sensation that she'd hoped never to experience again. It was the sort of clinical detachment that came from switching from civilian parent to operational mindset, and it carried with it the uncomfortable realization that retirement hadn't actually changed who she was at her core. Iris Chen Nakamura had officially died 7 years ago in a marketplace explosion on Kepler 442b, along with her entire Ghost Protocol team. The woman who'd survived had been someone else entirely. Someone with falsified credentials, a manufactured history, and the sort of carefully constructed identity that could withstand casual scrutiny but probably wouldn't survive serious investigation. She'd chosen civilian life, chosen motherhood, chosen the sort of existence that involved parent-teacher conferences instead of tactical briefings. The Ghost Protocol had been Earth's response to the uncomfortable realization that humans were simultaneously the galaxy's newest members and its most naturally gifted killers. Other species had evolved complex social structures, advanced technology, and sophisticated philosophical frameworks. Humans had evolved the ability to hunt anything with a pulse and the creativity to find 17 different ways to kill someone with a spoon. The program had recruited individuals who combined tactical brilliance with the sort of psychological flexibility that allowed them to blend into any environment while maintaining the capacity for extreme violence. They'd been deployed to situations where official Earth representatives couldn't operate, handling problems that required the sort of solutions that didn't appear in diplomatic textbooks. Iris had been one of the best, which was why she'd been selected for Operation Nightfall, a mission that had required infiltrating a Veltari smuggling operation that had been trafficking in human children. The operation had been successful, technically speaking. The smuggling ring had been eliminated, the children had been recovered, and the Veltari government had quietly agreed to enhance security protocols. The fact that 17 Veltari operatives had died in ways that appeared to be unfortunate accidents had been considered an acceptable outcome by everyone except the operatives themselves. The official report had described a series of equipment failures, environmental hazards, and coincidental mishaps that had resulted in the complete dismantling of the criminal organization. Iris had been officially retired after that mission, partly because her psychological profile had indicated she was developing what the bureaucrats called excessive emotional investment, and partly because she'd become pregnant. The Ghost Protocol had strict policies about operatives with family attachments, based on the reasonable assumption that people with something to lose made poor candidates for suicide missions. She'd spent the last 8 years convincing herself that she'd successfully transitioned to civilian life, that she'd left behind the sort of person who could make 17 people disappear while appearing to be nowhere near any of them. She'd believed that motherhood had changed her fundamental nature, that love had somehow overridden training and instinct. The bruise on her son's face suggested otherwise. Iris activated her personal terminal and began what appeared to be routine research into Haven 7's resident directory. Her fingers moved with the sort of practiced efficiency that came from years of gathering intelligence, though to any casual observer she might have been checking social media or reading news updates. Nextar, son of Administrator Haxtell, belonged to a family that had achieved considerable status within the Veltari diplomatic corps. His father held a position that involved negotiating trade agreements between the Veltari collective and various human colonies, while his mother served on several cultural exchange committees. They lived in the sort of prestigious quarters that came with diplomatic immunity and the sort of casual arrogance that made them believe rules applied to other people. The family had been stationed on Haven 7 for 2 years, during which time they developed a reputation for what the diplomatic community politely called assertive cultural pride, and what everyone else called being insufferable. Their son had apparently inherited their talent for making enemies, though he'd specialized in targeting those who couldn't retaliate. Iris's research expanded to include financial records, communication logs, and what appeared to be routine background checks. Her access credentials, left over from her previous career, still functioned despite her official death, suggesting that someone in the Ghost Protocol maintained a professional interest in her activities. The Veltari family's comfortable existence depended on a carefully maintained network of trade relationships, political connections, and social obligations. It was the sort of complex system that required constant maintenance, and appeared stable until someone began pulling the right threads. Iris had always been exceptionally good at finding the right threads. Her son had fallen asleep on the couch, his face relaxed in the sort of peaceful expression that made the bruise seem even more offensive. She covered him with a blanket and returned to her research, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a sort of focused intensity that suggested she was no longer thinking like a suburban parent. The woman who'd officially died on Kepler 442b had been recalled to active duty by the simple act of someone striking her child. The fact that this activation had been entirely unofficial would have concerned her if she'd been capable of caring about bureaucratic niceties. She had work to do. The first domino fell on a Tuesday, though Administrator Haxtell wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. His morning began with what appeared to be a routine communication from the Colonial Trade Commission, informing him that his latest shipment of Centurion crystals had failed quality inspection due to irregularities in molecular structure. The message was bureaucratically polite and thoroughly devastating, representing the loss of approximately 40,000 credits in expected revenue. Haxtell spent the morning making increasingly frantic calls to his various contacts, each conversation revealing new complications that seemed to multiply like particularly aggressive bacteria. His shipping permits had mysteriously expired, his insurance coverage had been flagged for review, and his primary trade partner had suddenly developed concerns about their long-term business relationship. By lunch, 3 more deals had collapsed in ways that appeared entirely coincidental but felt suspiciously coordinated. The administrator's whiskers twitched with the sort of nervous energy that suggested he was beginning to suspect that someone was playing a game he didn't understand. Meanwhile, his son Nextar had returned to the playground with a sort of swagger that came from successfully establishing dominance over inferior species. The young Veltari had spent the morning regaling his friends with detailed descriptions of how he'd disciplined the human spawn, apparently unaware that his family's comfortable existence was currently being dismantled by someone who viewed psychological warfare as a form of artistic expression. The second wave of Iris's campaign began on Wednesday, when the station's social hierarchy experienced what anthropologists might have called rapid restructuring, and what everyone else called, "Holy hell, what's happening to the Veltari family?" The administrator's wife discovered that her position on the Cultural Exchange Committee had been terminated due to budgetary constraints, while her membership in the Diplomatic Spouses Association had been suspended pending investigation into irregularities in her application. The family's social calendar, once packed with the sort of prestigious events that maintained their status, had suddenly become remarkably empty. Invitations were mysteriously withdrawn, previous commitments were discovered to have been miscommunicated, and their usual table at the station's exclusive restaurant had been permanently reserved by someone with better connections. Iris accomplished all of this from her modest quarters, her fingers dancing across keyboards with the sort of practiced efficiency that came from years of making problems disappear. She worked during the hours when Ethan was at school, maintaining her cover as a boring civilian contractor, while systematically destroying everything that made the Veltari family's life comfortable. The beauty of her approach lay in its complete deniability. Every setback the family experienced could be explained by bureaucratic incompetence, market fluctuations, or simple bad luck. The fact that these unfortunate coincidences were occurring with mathematical precision would have been obvious to anyone with training in operational tactics, but the Veltari specialized in diplomatic protocol rather than recognizing when they were being hunted. Thursday brought the sort of revelation that made Haxtel question whether his family had somehow offended a deity with particularly creative punishment methods. His personal accounts had been frozen pending investigation into suspicious transaction patterns. His clearance level had been reduced due to administrative review, and his office had been relocated to a storage closet that smelled suspiciously of decomposing organic matter. The administrator's attempts to contact his superior officers were met with the sort of bureaucratic stonewalling that suggested someone with considerable influence wanted him to remain isolated. His calls were transferred to departments that didn't exist. His messages were lost in communication networks that seemed designed by sadists, and his requests for meetings were scheduled for dates that wouldn't occur for several decades. By Friday, even Nexter had begun to notice that something was fundamentally wrong with his family's situation. The other children treated him with a sort of cautious politeness usually reserved for potentially explosive devices, while their parents regarded him with expressions that suggested they were calculating safe distances for their offspring. The young Veltari's confidence had begun to crack around the edges, replaced by the sort of nervous energy that came from discovering that actions sometimes produced consequences in ways that weren't immediately obvious. He'd spent the week looking for opportunities to demonstrate his dominance over the human child, but Ethan had remained frustratingly absent from his usual playground activities. What Nextar didn't know was that his target had been deliberately kept away from areas where further incidents might occur. Iris had decided that her son's safety required removing him from potential conflict zones while she completed her work, a decision that demonstrated the sort of protective instinct that made human parents particularly dangerous when properly motivated. The final act of her campaign would require a more direct approach, but first she needed to ensure that her audience was properly prepared to receive the message she intended to deliver. Part 4. The New Normal. The confrontation occurred near the memorial fountain when Iris noticed 3 familiar figures cornering her son. Nextar had apparently decided that his family's recent misfortunes required him to reassert dominance over the only target he believed he could still intimidate. Humanus Spawn still thinks it belongs here, Nextar announced, his voice carrying desperate aggression. His companions flanked Ethan with practiced efficiency, though their postures suggested considerably less enthusiasm. Iris approached with casual stride, carrying coffee and wearing the sort of mildly irritated expression that suggested interrupted errands. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying polite authority. "I think you're blocking the walkway." The 3 Veltari turned with annoyed expressions. "Human adult," Nextar replied dismissively. "This does not concern you." Iris took a sip of coffee and smiled, with the sort of pleasant expression that somehow managed to be more threatening than any scowl. "Actually, it does. You see, that's my son you're bothering." The revelation hung in the air ominously, and the 3 young Veltari exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to realize they'd made a tactical error of considerable magnitude. "Your spawn requires discipline," Nextar announced, though his voice carried considerably less conviction. "It disturbs the peace of superior species." Iris set down her coffee cup with precise movement. Her smile remained perfectly pleasant, though something in her eyes had shifted from suburban politeness to something considerably more professional. "Superior species," she repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting. Tell me, how superior do you feel right now?" What happened next would be discussed in hushed tones throughout Haven 7 for months afterward. Witnesses would later describe a series of movements that appeared almost casual, but resulted in all three Veltari adolescents finding themselves on the ground in positions that suggested they'd been arranged by someone with considerable expertise. Iris hadn't struck anyone, hadn't raised her voice, and hadn't done anything that could be classified as assault. She'd simply moved with fluid precision that made it clear she could have done considerably more damage if she'd chosen to exert herself. "Here's what's going to happen," she said with calm authority. "You're going to apologize to my son. You're going to explain to your friends that humans are not appropriate targets for your entertainment, and you're going to find new ways to occupy your time. Your family has been experiencing some unfortunate setbacks lately," Iris continued, her tone carrying conversational politeness that somehow made the words sound like a death threat. "Market fluctuations, administrative complications, social adjustments. These things happen when people make poor decisions about who they choose to antagonize." The three Veltari had gone very still, their earlier aggression replaced by absolute terror from realizing they'd been playing games with someone who operated by entirely different rules. "I trust we understand each other," Iris said, stepping back casually. The three bullies scrambled to their feet with desperate haste, departing without customary threats or posturing. The Veltari family left Haven 7 3 days later, their departure so sudden that most residents assumed they'd been recalled for emergency diplomatic duties. The official explanation involved restructuring of personnel assignments, though the speed suggested someone with considerable influence had decided their continued presence was inadvisable. Administrator Haxtell's replacement arrived within the week, a middle-aged Veltari with cautious demeanor that suggested he'd been thoroughly briefed on his predecessor's unfortunate experiences. The new administrator made a point of introducing himself to the station's human residents with respectful politeness. The playground returned to its normal state of controlled chaos, though the other alien children now treated Ethan with the sort of respectful deference usually reserved for diplomats or particularly dangerous predators. Their parents had apparently decided that teaching their offspring about appropriate social boundaries was considerably more important than they'd previously realized. Iris returned to her routine of data analysis and suburban domesticity, though the other residents of Haven 7 now regarded her with the sort of cautious respect that suggested they suspected she might be more than she appeared. The station's social dynamics had shifted in subtle but significant ways, with the human population finding themselves treated with considerably more courtesy than they'd previously experienced. The memorial fountain continued to celebrate interspecies cooperation, though it now served as an unofficial reminder that some forms of cooperation were more voluntary than others. Children of all species played together with renewed enthusiasm for inclusive activities, their parents having apparently discovered that tolerance was considerably easier to maintain when everyone understood the potential consequences of alternative approaches. Ethan had returned to his usual playground activities, though he now possessed the sort of confidence that came from knowing that his mother's definition of protecting her child extended considerably beyond the typical parental responses. The bruise on his cheek had faded completely, leaving no physical evidence of the incident that had triggered such comprehensive consequences. Deep in the station's communication networks, a message arrived for Iris from an address that officially didn't exist. The sender had included only a brief note: "Retirement suits you, impressive work. The offer stands if you change your mind." She deleted the message without responding, though she made a mental note to update her security protocols. Some chapters of her life were permanently closed, but apparently certain government agencies maintained a professional interest in her domestic projects. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson about the inadvisability of threatening human children. Though most species would never fully understand the specific mechanisms that had made the Veltari family's existence so comprehensively uncomfortable, the beauty of Iris's approach had been its complete invisibility, a masterclass in applied consequences that appeared to be nothing more than an unfortunate series of coincidences. Haven 7 continued its mission of promoting interspecies harmony, though the definition of harmony had apparently evolved to include a much clearer understanding of appropriate boundaries. The station's promotional materials were quietly updated to emphasize the importance of mutual respect and cultural sensitivity, changes that suggested someone in the administrative hierarchy had developed a more sophisticated appreciation for human parenting techniques. In the end, the incident had produced exactly the sort of educational outcome that the station's founders had intended, though the curriculum had been considerably more practical than they'd originally envisioned. The children of Haven 7 had learned about consequences, their parents had learned about assumptions, and the galaxy had received a subtle reminder that humans approached the protection of their offspring with the sort of creative dedication that made diplomatic immunity considerably less protective than advertised. The lesson had been delivered with the sort of professional competence that left no room for misunderstanding, and the results suggested that sometimes the most effective education occurred when people discovered that their actions produced responses they hadn't anticipated. The playground remained a place where different species could interact peacefully, though the peace was now maintained by a considerably more sophisticated understanding of what happened when that peace was disrupted. Irene Chen Nakamura had successfully defended her child using skills she'd hoped never to use again, and the galaxy was a marginally safer place for human children as a result. The irony wasn't lost on her that the most important mission of her career had been accomplished while officially retired, using abilities she'd claimed to have abandoned in service of the most fundamental parental duty. Some things, it seemed, were more important than official job descriptions. The weeks that followed brought a curious phenomenon that anthropologists would later classify as behavioral modification through observed consequences. Parents throughout Haven 7 began holding what they euphemistically called educational discussions with their offspring, conversations that invariably concluded with variations of, "and that's why we don't bother the human children." The aquatic collective's young had always been model citizens, but they now approached human children with the sort of reverent curiosity usually reserved for religious artifacts. The Centaurian larvae had developed an almost pathological need to include Ethan in their crystalline light displays, apparently believing that his approval might serve as protection against unspecified but terrifying consequences. Most amusing was the behavior of the remaining Veltari families, who had collectively decided that humans possessed some form of supernatural retribution abilities. Their children now offered Ethan the sort of elaborate gifts that suggested they were attempting to appease vengeful spirits, while their parents watched nervously from distances that indicated they'd calculated optimal escape routes. The station's teaching staff had quietly implemented new policies regarding conflict resolution and species sensitivity training, though the curriculum focused heavily on case studies involving humans and the importance of considering all available information before taking action. The fact that these lessons were delivered with the sort of intensity usually reserved for hazardous materials handling suggested that someone in the educational hierarchy had received very specific instructions about preventing future incidents. Iris observed these developments with the sort of professional satisfaction that came from seeing an operation produce results that extended well beyond its original parameters. Her son had become inadvertently famous as the child whose mother had made an entire family disappear through the application of what could only be described as aggressively competent parenting. The galaxy had learned that humans approached child-rearing with the sort of dedication that made other species question whether they'd been doing it correctly all along.